As I said, gender is a huge topic. There are entire courses devoted to it. So what I'm going to do right now is do some like quick rundowns of just the areas of sort of gender's effects that are discussed in your textbook. We'll sort of do some explanation and sort of talk a little bit through what that looks like. And so on that logic, the first one we're going to sort of talk about is this idea of gender and education. And one of the things that sort of we could talk about in terms of numbers, by and large, the idea of women, like women are getting more and more education in sort of Canadian society. They're actually more likely than men to have post-secondary education right now. That's connected to a bunch of other things in terms of occupational choices and that kind of thing. But what I want to sort of talk about a little bit is like what that looks like. Okay, so your textbook talks a little bit about the idea of a hidden curriculum, which is all of the things that your school teaches you that are not officially in like the curriculum. So when you are in like a math class, and I'll talk with math classes as an example here, but in a math class, the curriculum, like if you go and look at Alberta Education's website, for example, the curriculum will tell you like, oh, we're studying multiplying fractions. Okay. And whether or not you learn to multiply fractions is sort of how the curriculum measures it. But in sociology, we talk about there being a hidden curriculum and that there's a bunch of other stuff you learn while you are learning to multiply fractions that, in fact, has nothing to do with multiplying fractions. And a way to sort of think about that might be to think about how you learn whether or not school or math class in particular is a place for you, right? Whether you are expected to do well, whether or not this is going to be hard for you, whether this is going to be easy, whether this is going to be valuable for you. And you learn that in a whole bunch of different ways that have essentially nothing to do with math. So, for example, if you are in a math class, say you're taking an advanced math class, and you tell someone that and they go, oh, that's really great, are you headed into engineering? That's a set of interactions that is likely to tell you that you belong in math classes. And on the other hand, you might tell someone the same thing, that you're in the same math class, and get a different sort of response of like, really, why would you take such a hard class? Okay, and that tells you something different about whether or not you are expected to belong in that math class. We have those sort of external pieces. We also have, and like those sort of from family, from friends, from all kinds of other places. You also get sort of conversations around the hidden curriculum specifically and sort of education and gender within the classroom. One of the things that we sort of, and I'm using math classes for as a reason, as an example on purpose here, because this is part of sort of what happens, but one of the things that we have sort of found when we like basically did hundreds of hours of observation in math classes to figure out like what teachers are actually doing is one of the things that we sort of talk about in terms of teaching the hidden curriculum, and there's sort of a lot of stuff about the idea that girls are less likely to take advanced math classes, all of that sort of stuff. That part of the reason and part of the way that that actually happens in terms of like how do you actually produce that outcome is that teachers respond to male and female students differently in the classroom. So, for example, if you are like, so for example, a male student who is asked a question in their math class and gives an incorrect answer, okay, the teacher is more likely to respond to them and say, oh, how did you get to that answer? So that they have to explain their reasoning, and then the teacher can go, oh, you made a mistake in step 3. This is the misconception we need to correct so that you can continue to do that. Okay? And that's a perfectly valid response. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that response. But we create unequal gender outcomes when a female student who gives perhaps the same wrong answer to the same question doesn't get that sort of interaction about explain your reasoning, where did you go wrong? And instead the teacher moves on and asks a different student for the answer. Okay? And those two interactions are quite different for a variety of reasons. One of which is that if I just move on from you if you don't give me the correct answer instead of asking you to explain your reasoning, then one of the things that I'm communicating to you as an educator is that I don't really expect you to be able to sort this out. And like, oh, okay, I guess you don't have the right answer. That's fine. Whereas if you get it wrong and I ask you to explain it, that's coming from a space that communicates to a student, oh, this teacher expects me to be able to do this, and they're surprised when I can't, so they're making me explain where it goes wrong, and then I learn where the error is, right? And one of the things that that means is that those sorts of things, like in a single interaction, that probably doesn't mean anything. But when you sort of build it over time, right? If you're talking about that kind of difference in interactions in math classes over 4, 5, 10 years, then one of the things that you wind up with is that at the end of the day, you have male students who are likely to be objectively better at math. Not necessarily because they're naturally more gifted at it, but because they've had all of those interactions that teach them to correct their own thinking, right? To figure out where the error is and to fix it, and have been communicated for a really long time that they are expected to be good at that, right? And that is sort of a really kind of important piece to understand, is that in a lot of ways, the idea of gender socialization and of sort of unequal sort of outcomes for gender are the product of a lot of different things. They're not necessarily just like, in sociology, we generally sort of assume that those differences are not purely biological. It's not just like, oh, girls' brains don't do math. It's about conversations around practice, around expectation, around whether or not you are expected and allowed to quit if you find something difficult, or whether you're expected to push through it, which creates some really interesting results, right? Um, in that, so again, like in this context of like how we understand things, being good at math is not apparently an objective quantity. So if I take math students who have exactly the same grade, pick any number, right? 85, 80, whatever, pick a number. You take a whole bunch of math students who have exactly that score in their math classes, right? So the score is the same in the same classes. And you ask them, are you good at math? The boys are way more likely to say yes, and the girls are way more likely to say no. They're getting the same grade, which tells you a lot of things in terms of how we interpret this, and this idea about a hidden curriculum in terms of how good at math do you have to be in order to do that, and like, are you rewarded for being good at math? Are you expected to be good at math? All of those things exist in this idea of like the hidden curriculum, and we could go through a very similar sort of exercise talking about how you learn if English matters or social studies matters or science matters or any number of those other things. I just happen to know the math data, so that's the one that I was talking about. And when we sort of start talking about this, we also have to understand some conversations about people being very conscious of that. So if you're in an environment where girls are not expected to be good at math, okay, and you happen to be good at math, right? Like you enjoy mathematics, or you're pursuing a career that's going to require it, whatever that sort of is, you're likely to be in a situation where you are aware that people are expecting you to fail at a certain thing. And when you are aware of people expecting you to fail, whether that's sort of statistically or like, that particular teacher is expecting you personally to fail, both of those tend to cause anxiety, and by and large, anxiety reduces performance. So you can, like, again, math is an example, but like you can do all kinds of fun things with that. Fun from like an experimental psychology, not necessarily from a social perspective, to sort of say, like, if I make female students aware of their own gender before they write a math test, they will do worse on it than if they're not aware of their gender. Like, all of that stuff plays into this idea of a hidden curriculum and sort of experiences of the hidden curriculum and of schooling in terms of who gets attention and what kind of attention they get and what kinds of criticisms they get. For students who are in the broad category of LGBTQIA2S+, which is the sort of acronym for all kinds of sexual and gender minorities, and they do have different experiences for a variety of reasons, but there's a lot of this experience that pairs all of that idea about hidden curriculum and gender with a bunch of experiences of heteronormativity, right? So examples of heteronormativity that might be relevant in the sort of like an educational context is think about going on a school camping trip. Okay, you're in high school, you're going on a school camping trip, and if your high school is anything like mine, the assumption is that, oh, this is the girls' floor, this is the guys' floor. Okay, fine, but that's making an assumption about where sexual contact is likely to occur and who's likely to have what in common with who else, right? In the sense that, like, okay, when schools separate male and female students, for example, overnight, largely they're trying to avoid sexual contact, but that makes that builds in an assumption about who's trying to have sexual contact with who. We have a lot of conversations that we talk about in terms of like those experiences of sexual and gender minorities in the classroom, right? In that, if you think about every sex ed class you've ever took, you've probably dealt a lot more with like the mechanics of pregnancy than any number of other things, like how two women negotiate sex, what does that look like, to say nothing of all of the like identity pieces that go along with sexuality and sexual identity and gender expression and all of those pieces. So in a lot of ways we have curriculum too that isn't necessarily meeting the needs of students in that group who identify as LGBTQIA 2S plus in any number of sort of spaces. That's not all doom and gloom. GSAs, so gay straight alliances, really, 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 really help to offer students sort of spaces to talk about that. You'll also see that on some university campuses when we start talking about things like women's centers, to provide that same kind of support for sort of people working through experiences that don't make a ton of sense to them. But that is a whole other kind of complex piece about sort of peer socialization and how one reacts in that environment, right? When we're talking about something like being an adolescent, not fitting into norms of hegemonic masculinity can be really difficult for a person's sense of self, right? All kinds of challenges like that.